If you're new to the sewing game, you're in the right place because today I'm going to be talking about something that can make or break your sewing project. Knowing or not knowing this information can make your sewing experience a dream or a living hell. Today we're going to be talking about 4 essential things: your stitch length, your stitch width, your stitch tension, and your needle position. I'm going to be demonstrating on the Singer 4423 heavy duty sewing machine. This dial right here allows you to adjust your stitch length. This dial right here allows you to adjust your stitch width. This one allows you to adjust the needle position, and this one allows you to adjust the stitch tension. Now let's get into all of these individually. The stitch length dial has 5 numbers on it, including a buttonhole symbol. If you want to stitch long, you go all the way to number 4. If you want to stitch short, you go all the way to number 1. If you want to stitch a buttonhole, you go to the buttonhole symbol that's between the 1 and the 0. And if you want to just stay in one position while you stitch, then you would put your stitch length dial on 0, because you just want your needle to go from left to right. That is, of course, with a zigzag stitch. That is going to have your needle staying in that one position instead of going forward like it does when it's on one of the other stitch lengths. Now, if you have your stitch length dial on 4, you're gonna get some very long stitches. And this is usually ideal when you are gathering fabric or when you want to do a stitch detail that has that kind of feature. When you put your stitch dial on a 2, your stitches are going to be really short. The shorter your stitch length, the slower your machine is going to sew. The longer your stitch length, the faster your sewing machine is going to sew, because it's covering a longer distance at a time in comparison to when you have a short stitch length, it's covering a short distance at a time. When you are stitching seams, you want to use a stitch length of 2.5 or 3.5, anywhere between there, because what that will do is lock in the seams so that you don't see any threads showing whenever you open or pull at your seams. If you've ever held a piece of garment that is poorly stitched, you will notice that when you pull on the seam, you can see the threads, and that's because a long stitch length was used or the thread tension was loose. So let's move on to that. Now, the thread tension is pretty much how tight your top or bottom thread is stitching. The bottom thread comes from the bobbin, so we're also going to call that the bobbin thread. If you are stitching lightweight fabrics such as chiffon, mesh, or challis, then a thread tension of 2 to 3 is ideal. But if you are sewing thicker fabrics such as denim, cotton, or linen, your thread tension should be between 4 and 6. If you're doing gathers, however, you can use the longest possible thread tension. If you're doing shirring, you want to use the highest possible thread tension. 4 is usually the ideal tension, and that's why it is labeled like this. You see the 4 in the middle right there. That's the ideal tension. But like I said, you want to use a lower tension if you are stitching on lighter weight fabrics. Heavy or medium weight fabrics tend to have a much tighter composition. Just think about it like a braid in your hair. If you braid your hair really tightly, that would be what the medium to heavyweight fabrics are like. But if you braid it very loosely or just do like a rope twist, that would be what the lighter weight fabrics are like. So you need a little more pressure on the thread when you're sewing heavier fabrics in comparison to when you are sewing lighter fabrics. You don't really need that much pressure. If you find that your thread is looping at the back of your fabric, it's likely because your thread tension is too low. If you find that your bottom thread is coming to the top of your fabric, it's likely that your tension is too high. Now we're going to talk about the stitch width. The stitch width is specifically for when you are using zigzag stitches. This isn't very relevant for when you're doing straight stitches, unless of course you want to be able to change your needle position. If you want to change your needle position to the left, right, or the middle, then you want to make sure that your stitch width is on 0. If your stitch width is on any other number, the needle position dial will not work. If you look at the symbol on the top of your sewing machine here, you will see that the more you move it to this direction, the bigger your stitches will become. So the width is from left to right or right to left, while the length is going forward. So if you put your sewing machine on a stitch width of 1, you're going to end up with a stitch that goes from left to right, but it's not very wide at all. But if you put it all the way to 6, it's going to be very wide. Now, in combination with the stitch length, and this is in particular with your zigzag stitches, like I said earlier, if you have a stitch width of 6, but you have a stitch length of 1, you're going to find that your needle is only going to move a short distance, but it's still going to do a really thick stitch. And that's what you would do in the event that you want to create like a satin stitch or you want to embroider with your sewing machine. You would put it on a high stitch width but a low stitch length. This is very cute. This is stitch width 3 and stitch length 1. I recommend that you create a stitch directory or like a stitch reference. What you'll do is to just do a zigzag stitch in every possible stitch width and every possible stitch length, and do a straight stitch in every possible stitch length, and that will allow you to see how each of the functions work. Label all of the stitches so that you will know what stitch length and stitch width to use for your sewing projects. The best thing is to test on a scrap piece of fabric before you actually start on your project, so that way you can know if the settings are correct on your sewing machine. One of the most common mistakes that you can make as a beginner sewist is stitching on your main fabric before you even know that the stitches are gonna do what it's supposed to do. So you just want to make sure that you test on a scrap piece of fabric first. Now let's talk about the final thing, which is the needle position. This is something that maybe you don't even pay attention to, and this has probably led you into a few problems, creating a hell in your sewing experience. And because I don't want that for you, I have to tell you right now that your needle position is so important. Like I said, the only way you're going to be able to adjust your needle position is if your stitch width is on a 0. Now, when you insert something like a zipper foot into your sewing machine, you are going to have to switch your needle position to the left or to the right. If it's in the center, you're gonna stitch and you're gonna break your needle, because there's a centerpiece right there in the zipper foot that your needle is gonna go down on, it's gonna jam, and it's gonna break under pressure. In comparison to a regular presser foot that actually has a space at the left, right, and center for your needle. So that's something you have to remember when you're switching from a regular presser foot to a zipper foot. There are also some instances where you might want to change the position of your needle to get a different seam allowance. If you have your needle positioned on the left, that's going to be 1/8 of an inch away from the edge of the presser foot. If you have your needle positioned in the middle, that's 1/4 of an inch away from the edge of the presser foot. And if you have your needle on the right, that is 1/2 of an inch away from the edge of the presser foot. So you can actually use your needle position as an accurate mark of how far you are sewing away from the edge of your fabric if you align it with the edge of your presser foot. When you align it with the edge of the presser foot, that's going to give you an accurate measure. And if you make sure that every time you stitch, your fabric is in alignment with the edge of the presser foot, you will always stitch in a straight line.